We're now going to hear from Kathleen Lowrey from Canada. She's Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Alberta.
I will be speaking to women's rights to peaceful freedom of assembly and association. So this right is abrogated by men and male authorities under the banner of both tradition and progress. What I'd like to speak about today is the way that it must be women who decide how their rights to freedom of assembly and association are exercised. When women's rights to peaceful freedom of assembly and association are abrogated in the name of tradition, men and male authorities say that their values either are or ought to be shared by women, such that women who do mind the abrogation of these rights don't matter. Of course, women object to being shut out of public life in the name of tradition, as, for example, Indira Gandhi observes here very sharply about the memories of her mother of being shut out of public life in the name of tradition. When women's rights to peaceful freedom of assembly and association are abrogated by men and male authorities in the name of progress, these male authorities again say that their values either already are shared by women or ought to be shared by women. Again, women object and are organizing to say so. While the traditional approach is to deny women access to public life, the progressive approach is to deny women a private life. In particular, women are enjoined socially and increasingly legally to open intimate spaces to trans-identified males. So this image is from a campaign by a United Kingdom women's organization that, among other things, they're campaigning to keep trans-identified men out of women's prisons. Now, women's prisons are one of the many women's spaces in many countries that are being forcibly opened to males in the name of progress. The point is, whether in the name of tradition or in the name of progress, whether forcibly keeping women out of public space or forcing men into women's spaces, these are decisions taken by male authorities, justified by male authorities as for the general good, and they are decisions to which, of course, women object very strongly. Women's ability to object and their ability not only to gather and discuss these objections, but to have these objections reflected in legislation and policy, these are fundamental rights. The ability to gather together to discuss our rights, the ability to have the decisions we make, the ideas that we circulate in these gatherings, the ability to have these decisions reflected in public policy. This is at the basis of all the other rights that we're talking about today. If we cannot do this, we cannot defend any of the rights that we've talked about today. This is not a hypothetical problem, but a very urgent one. In countries like my own, Canada, that style themselves as progressive, women are being threatened and punished for asserting their rights to peaceful freedom of assembly and association. So in Canada, there's an organization called Vancouver Rape Relief. It offers women-only services for women facing domestic violence, women facing sexual assault. And we know that domestic violence and sexual assault are primarily forms of male violence. So this offers services to women facing male violence. In 2019, Vancouver Rape Relief was stripped of funding by the Vancouver City Council because of their women-only policy and faced violent misogynist attacks, including having a rat nailed to its front door by trans activists. The phrase "kill TERFs" was sprayed on its entry. TERFs is an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. This is a term usually used as a term of abuse. What it means is women, like the women in Vancouver Rape Relief, who do not wish to open their spaces to men. So who, for example, do not wish to open a rape shelter to trans-identified men. These attacks are the mirror image of similar informal and formal sanctions applied to women who object to being excluded from public life in traditional settings. So that the objections to women to having their private spaces invaded by men, the attacks made on women for objecting to that, exactly parallel the attacks made on women who object to being shut out of public life in traditional settings. So on the surface, these look very different, but the kinds of discipline applied to women who object to decisions made by men in the name of progress, and the kinds of discipline applied to women who object to decisions made by men in the name of tradition, the violence and the disciplinary force and the recruitment, not just so the combination of both informal sanctions of shaming, of harassment, combined with the recruitment of legal authority to enforce these practices, these are exactly the same. The rights of women to peaceful freedom of association and assembly have two faces. The first is the right to public participation in civic deliberation and the life of their culture. So that includes just walking around, just seeing what's going on, being allowed to freely walk around, being allowed to go to school, being allowed to go to music shows, being allowed to visit museums, being allowed to go to sports events. That kind of participation in the full banquet of public life is an important feature of women's rights to peaceful freedom of association and assembly. And we're probably more familiar with these rights being under attack in traditionalist societies. But the second face of women's rights to peaceful freedom of association and assembly is the right to a dignified private life. The right to be safe in intimate spaces like changing rooms, to be able to seek safe harbor when in danger from male violence, to have, even in prison, so even if you've violated the terms of your society in such a way that you've been sent to prison, the right, even in prison, to a sense of security in going about the intimate business of bathing, toileting, dressing, and sleeping. Safe access to public life and security of private existence are mutually constitutive. It is why men are careful in every setting to guarantee these rights to themselves. These mutually constitutive aspects, the safe access to public life and security of private existence, these underpin women's rights to peaceful freedom of assembly and association. We expect the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women to defend and uphold these rights for women around the world and in any context under which they're threatened, whether that context is a traditional context or whether that context is a putatively progressive context. Thank you very much.